And so this week, if you wanted to kind of add to the subtitle, we had the King's Victory. You could do maybe lessons from winning. I think that there are always lessons from winning. A lot of times if you ask people, how you accomplish the thing that you accomplished, like it's hard to pinpoint sometimes. And I think it's worth doing an autopsy on David's victory to see what we can learn from this story. So we're going to look at the story of David and Goliath. And this story, obviously well known, probably one of the most well-known battles of human history, right? We use this battle to describe other battles that took place after this battle. We use this story to explain conflicts. We use it in storytelling. We use it in literature. We even use it in sports. Like you've turned on a basketball game or a football game, and they're like, it's David versus Goliath. And what we do is we kind of reduce it down to like this really kind of Neanderthal idea. It's like little man beat big man. Isn't that kind of what we do with this story? It's like, oh, all of a sudden you're a caveman. Little man beat big man. But there are so many more details to this story, and there's so much more to unpack, and that's what we're going to do today. Y'all ready? So we're going to pick up the story where we left off last week. We left off last week, kind of, the build-up, the lead-up to the battle, and it ends with David explaining to Saul, I'm about to go fight this dude. The same God that delivered me from the paw of the bear and the paw of the lion is also going to deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul's response was, God be with you, right? The Lord be with you. Go with God. And so that's where we'll pick up. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 38 and 39. It says, let me kind of set this thing up properly. We're going to read about 20 more verses this week. We're going to finish the entire chapter of 1 Samuel 17. But we are going to take restroom breaks. Not literal, right? We're on a journey. We're going to stop at Buc-ee's and explain some things as we go. Then Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head. And he clothed him with armor. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them off. So Saul sees that David is serious about going to fight Goliath, and he's like, well, let's at least put some armor on you and give you a weapon so that you can go do this foolish thing that you're about to do. And so we're going to stop. We didn't make it very far, right? Sometimes, have you had this happen with your kids? Like your kids, do you need to use the restroom before we leave? No. They get in the car and you start driving. Oh, I have to use the restroom. That's what just happened. We're stopping quick. And so there's an important detail in just the first two verses that we read there that becomes a time-tested principle for us. David knows who David is. David knows he's very comfortable with who he is. He's confident with who he is. He knows his limitations and he knows his capabilities. David also knows who he's not. David knows that he's not Saul. So David doesn't try to put on Saul's armor to go fight the fight that he is supposed to go fight. It's possible that this story could have had a very different ending had David put on Saul's armor, had David tried to pretend to be somebody else and then go fight his battle. And I thought the preaching was better than the response. That's some good preaching, because y'all see what's happening here, right? Like if that's not kind of indicative of the culture that we live in, where everybody else is trying to pretend everybody else, and they're so uncomfortable with who they are, and then they can't figure out why they keep having these struggles and these losses and getting beat up all the time. And what's so fascinating is, like, if you would just be you. If we would find the ability to be comfortable with who God has made us to be and the things that God has equipped us to do and the things that God has called us to do, and run that race and stay in that lane and stop trying to put on somebody else's fit, right? If we would stop and look, and there's a balance to this, right? We learn from other people, certainly. Like you've got mentors and you've got people that you learn from, but you take the information, you take the principles, and you make it your own. You make it kind of fit to who God has made you to be, and then you go do the thing that you do, and you stop trying to be somebody else. And that's not just the message for teenagers, by the way. You know what we do I can say this, like as I get older, is like then we really start to become, well, do as I say, not as I do. Right? I'm telling you to stop doing what everybody else is doing just because everybody else is doing. I'm telling you to stop pretending to be somebody that you're not. And yet, as adults, so often we kind of do the same thing. Like, we get on the same social media platforms and we look at the same people who are doing big things and we try to, okay, I'm going to move on. And there are so many ways that this has been explained, right? We've heard all of this stuff. Comparison is the thief of joy, right? It's not fair to compare. And the point is that you just have to be, we have to be comfortable enough with who we are to try not to be anybody else. We don't have to be anybody else. This is kind of cheesy, but this is the way that I've explained this to myself first and then to others over the years. You are the only you. It's Dr. Seussish, right? You are the only you. You are the only you, and only you can do what you can do, so you better do what God has called you to do. I think that when we don't do that, when you don't realize that you are the only you, and you don't do what God has called you to do, we leave a gap in the world that God has placed us in because we're not offering our specific gifting, calling, and talents to serve those around us, and the world is just less because we aren't who we are supposed to be. Okay, moving on. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 40, it says, he took his stick, so he took it off, which I think is, if you wanted to kind of reduce that principle down to one thing, is like, take that stuff off, right? If you're trying to be somebody else, you're trying to act like somebody else, you're trying to look like somebody else, take that stuff off. Okay, and then he discarded that. He took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. And he put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So he went from kind of like higher level weaponry and armory to very basic weaponry and armory. But again, David knew who he was. He knew his gifting. He knew what he was capable of. He knew what his experience had led him to be able to do. And I think that's kind of the point here is, and it builds on some of the things that we've already talked about. David, he was wise enough to understand that his experience and his talent were the key for success in this endeavor, right? He knew that he had spent some time with the stick and with this sling. He was comfortable with it. He knew that all of his experience, in fact, they say that a lot of scholars believe that as David was in the field shepherding the sheep, I don't know how many of you are parents of young boys. This will make perfect sense to you, right? So David is out in the field by himself, and he's got a sling, not like a cheap Kmart slingshot, but a sling is not a toy. A sling is a weapon of mass destruction. If you've seen videos, I mean, these things are like, they're whipping around, and when they're like pinpoint lethal accuracy, and it's like so fascinating. Google it, YouTube. Look, it's cool. And so I can imagine, and scholars kind of point to this, is like all of the time that David spent out in the field by himself with sheep, he was probably owning his skills. He was probably, I mean, if you're a little boy and you're in the field and you see a rock, you're going to pick it up. And if you just so happen to have a sling, you're going to put it in a sling. And if you just so happen to have a target, you're going to try to hit that target again and again and again and again. So for years, David had been practicing with the sling. It's one of the more kind of well-known parts of the story. But there's a couple of things in this passage that I think are less well-known. And I'm uncertain about all of the details, but I think this one's worth looking at. It says that David picked up 5 smooth stones. The smooth part makes perfect sense because you kind of want, it's got to be smooth so that it travels more accurately. But why 5? And it wasn't because David trusted his accuracy. There's one scholar that believes that it's because Goliath actually had 4 brothers. And David wasn't just coming for the big fella. He was coming for all of them. All of them. He's like, you and your mama and your brother, all of you. I'm coming. What's the modern vernacular? He was standing on business, right? He was ready. And I think that is so fascinating. It's not that he didn't trust his capability. He was like, I'm coming for all y'all. All y'all. So that's so cool. But here's what I want to land on from this particular passage. So the word stick, it says he took his stick in his hand and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones. So that stick, why is David taking a stick into a battle with a giant? Why isn't David using a sword? And here's what I think is fascinating about that. The word used for stick there is very specific. So it has one of two meanings. It means like a twig, which could be used like a wand, right? Probably not taking a wand into battle against Goliath unless he's Gandalf, right? That'd be a different story. So the other explanation or the other definition of that particular word is a staff used by someone walking across country or tending sheep. It's possible that this is the same stick that David had when he was back tending sheep for his father. Every time that he went back and forth, he grew up doing that, and then he even went to serve the king, and he would go back and serve his father, and it's very possible that this is the same stick that was there while he was being faithful and consistent all the way. This stick was representative of David's consistency and faithfulness. Now it was in the mix of God showing to David his consistency and his faithfulness. What a cool story, right? That this stick had seen it all. It had seen it all, and now it was going to be part of, again, probably the greatest battle in human history, at least well known in terms of, notoriety. Pretty cool. Let's move on. 1 Samuel 17, 41 through 47. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. He was actually kind of offended that they sent out this little fella, and again, here he is, this warrior from his youth. For he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. I love how that's the third time that's been thrown into the story. I mean, he's young, handsome guy, right? The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Then the Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin." Remember, Goliath is kitted up. Like he's got weapons on top of weapons, a spear, a javelin, and a sword. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. In other words, you done messed up. This day, the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the armies of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So there's a couple of things. Like, again, I think it's fascinating that David took the stick and the sling, because if David took a sword and defeated a giant with a sword, obviously God would be with him, but doesn't God get so much more attention and credit? Isn't it such a situation for God to use David when he doesn't even necessarily, from the optics of it, have the right tools to do the thing, right? And it's just like, you did what with what? God must have been in that thing, right? So that was kind of the first thing. But I think there's an even more powerful message, an equally powerful message, right? Everything matters, it's all important. But I think there's an incredibly powerful message in here that it's not just that David was not afraid to face this giant. The story of David and Goliath is not just that David defeated Goliath, the giant. I think one of the greater stories, kind of a sub-story to that, is that David was not intimidated by this giant. And I think a lot of times, isn't that something that we could probably learn from? When we understand that God is for us, when we understand that God is with us, I think it changes the way that we view the obstacles and kind of our own giants. I believe that a lot of us really think that we're going to be victorious and we're going to experience some success and all of that sort of things. All of those sorts of things. But I think sometimes we don't approach things with the fearlessness that God has called us and given us the ability to approach things with. It's like it says in the New Testament, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love, power, and of a sound mind. And I think David in this moment embodied that. It's so amazing that David defeated a giant. It's almost even more amazing that David stood in the face of the giant and was not afraid. And I think that's the lesson for us, is we don't have to live intimidated by anyone or anything, right? As long as we're being who God has called us to be, if we're on the path that God has called us to, intimidation is not a tactic that has an effect on us. We can look at our situation for what it is. We can look at our circumstances for what they are. We could allow the magnitude of them to overwhelm us, or we could look at them through the lens of faith and trust, knowing that our lives are in the hands of God, that we are doing what he's called us to do, we're being who he's called us to be. And ultimately, if that is the case, he is responsible for the outcome. And if he's responsible for the outcome, I don't have to be intimidated and I don't have to be afraid. I can truly live with that not having a spirit of fear, but of love and of power and a sound mind. It's not just that he defeated the giant. It's also that he wasn't intimidated by the giant. A lot of times I've seen this. You've probably seen this. I've done this. It's like we're going to get through whatever we're going through, but I'll be completely honest with you. I'm terrified in the moment, right? And we don't have to live like that. We don't have to live intimidated. We can also not just beat them, but we can also not be afraid of them. 1 Samuel 17, verses 48 through 51. We're moving quickly. Everybody good? Good. It says, then it happened. This is the story, right? This is the part that everybody kind of jumps to that we're all excited about. Also, a little morbid than you may have remembered from your children's Bible. It says, then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. Again, not intimidated, not afraid of the moment. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. I mean, talk about accuracy. Now, I imagine he's a big guy. He probably got a big forehead. But still, I mean, that's a small window for him to hit, and he does it with accuracy, pinpoint accuracy. So he slings it, and it struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. Why did he need a sword? Because he told the giant, after I kill you, I'm going to cut off your head. And he needs a stick's not going to do that, right? And a sling's not going to do that, so he needs a sword. So David then ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword. He took Goliath's sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. Now, I do want to point out there's an interesting kind of detail in there. It says that David prevailed over the Philistine, and he struck him and killed him. And then it says that he took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him. And so it says he killed him twice. I think it's kind of like the Princess Bride. He was mostly dead, right? He was pretty much gone, but he took out the sword to fit it to secure the deal. Then he was totally dead, completely dead, right? And he cut off his head. He cut off his head with it. Now, I know this part of the story is a little bit morbid, cutting off heads and whatnot, but there is a principle in here that I think makes this worth spending a little bit of time on. And I think it's so fascinating. I think it's so noteworthy that David didn't have a sword. I think it was very intentional that David didn't have a sword. But David goes and takes Goliath's sword to cut off his own head. Now, here's what's fascinating. That sword was the sword that was intended to take David out. The same sword that was intended to kill him now became the weapon that he used to take out the thing that tried to kill him. Do y'all see what I'm talking about? So if you kind of start to reduce this down and kind of make it into a principle, the principle is this. Goliath is the enemy in the story, right? Right? Okay, Goliath is the enemy in the story, right? Yes, so Goliath is the bad guy. Goliath is our nemesis here. He is the enemy in the story. And what the enemy intended to destroy, what the enemy intended for destruction, David took the sword and he used it for good. And so this is the way this thing starts to play out for us. What the enemy of your life intended for destruction in your life, what he thought he was going to use to take you out, God can take that thing and turn it around so that it will become the greatest weapon in your life. Well, we're starting to... It's like it's a choo-choo train. It's just got to start. It's got to get going. You know, like you start with the chug, 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 and okay. here's the thing, like the thing that you've struggled with in your life so much and you can't understand why you're struggling so much with it and why it's been so hard for you to get over it and why this thing has popped up for, this time in my life and it just always seems to be the thing that has been one of the greatest battles in your life can become the greatest weapon in your life. The thing, you know what, if you think about it like this, that sword became David's testimony. Right? He took the sword and it became his testimony. Do you remember when God used me to take down that giant? And he's got the sword as his testimony. Do you know that your testimony is a weapon? It says in the book of Revelation that they overcame by the blood of the Lamb. God is the one who does it. And the word of their testimony. Your testimony, what you've gone through, your battles, your struggles, all of those things can be used by God to do great things if we will allow him to do it. So in a strange way, like Goliath's sword is kind of like our testimony. So the next time you think about cutting off somebody's head, it's biblical. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. What could have destroyed you might propel you to your greatest victories. And it's not just, again, I think we always set this up as a reminder that it's not just for you, it's not just about you, it's what God ultimately can do through you. That David's victory wasn't just victory for him, it was victory for an entire nation. And so the struggle, the victory, the weapon, all of that will ultimately be used not just for you, but for those around you. Moving on, 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 52 through 54. It says, when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Like, just that quick. It was that easy, right? One dude dies, you take one thing out, and everybody gone. The men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron, and the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sha'arim, even to Gath. It's got to be one of those. Just pick one. Even to Gath and Ekron, the sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camps. Then David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. Again, morbid detail, but it's documentation of what has taken place. And then it says, but he put his weapons in his tent. What were his weapons? He had his stick, he had his sling, and now he had the sword of Goliath. And he kept that for himself, which again it's kind of like when you see the symbolism of it, like, no, this is mine. This is my story. This is what God has done for me, in me, and through me. And I'm going to take this, and I'm going to keep this, and I'm going to use this as a reminder to everyone who needs to hear it that this is what is possible if you will submit your life to God. And okay, y'all see what I'm doing? So not really a big principle here, but this is really kind of just more of a gloat. Can we gloat every once in a while in church? We're going to finish with humility and all of that stuff. But I think it's so fascinating. And I love how really human nature has not changed for thousands of years. Have you noticed that the people who were the most vocal against you, Philistines stacked up on one side of the valley, taunting for days and days about how weak and pitiful and pathetic and minuscule you are, and how weak your God is, that he couldn't even protect you from them. So for days and days and days, they've pitted themselves against them, taunting them, and then one thing happens and they're gone, right? It's amazing how the people who are the most vocal about you when you're down or when you're struggling, this is kind of the way this plays out. It's like, yeah, I knew that was going to happen. Told you so, right? And you're struggling and you're down, or whatever it is that you're going through, and then you start to have you come back. You start to have you come up, and then like they got nothing to say. I've noticed, and maybe you have noticed, that once the safety net of a keyboard disappears, people flee as far as the valley. And there's dead bodies all, and I'm just kidding, that's a little too much. But they flee, they're gone, right? Again, not really a point, just more of it's just fascinating to know human nature hasn't really changed. You know that bullies really are just, a lot of times they're coward that haven't been punched yet. It's kind of what it is. Like they're incredibly brave until they're faced with a moment where they actually have to really be brave, and then they're not brave any longer. Moving on. Actually, finishing up. There we go. 1 Samuel 17, 55 through 58. It says, now when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner was his general, Abner, whose son is this young man? Now, I'm at this point, I'm like, Saul, this is where I kind of draw the conclusions that Saul is so self-concerned, self-infatuated. Like, are you paying attention to anything? Like, have you been following the story about yourself, or are you just so delusional? So Saul's like, hey, whose son is this young man? And Abner said, by your life, O king, I do not know. The king said, you inquire whose son the youth is. So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? Because remember, the incentive was that whoever goes and fights Goliath, his father's house will be free from taxation. I'm like, I'll send all my boys, all of them. Yeah, I'm just kidding. Just better the odds, right? Whose son are you, young man? And David answered. This is the finish of this particular chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 17 finishes with, I am the son of your servant, Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And I love how David's story, like if you think about it, like David's story began with Samuel comes to Jesse's house to find the next king of Israel. Again, overlooked and underestimated. David comes up, and I am the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And he's anointed as the next king of Israel. Now, after the greatest victory in his life up to that point, and maybe ever, right, he responds with essentially kind of a reminder of his humble beginnings and also maintaining or holding on to, at that point, I mean, you just pulled off the greatest victory in the history of the nation of Israel, possibly. Can't nobody tell you nothing, right? I can be like, I ain't nobody's kid. I am my own man. Ain't nobody telling me what to do. Ain't nobody telling me how to live. I am David who just killed Goliath. That's who I am. But David, in humility, was like, I am David, the son of Jesse from Bethlehem. That's who I am. And I love that it's kind of a fascinating bookend to this particular story, how he started and the humility that he maintained even when he was experiencing some victories. It was a lesson from winning. So let's recap our lessons for the day. You guys just covered 20 verses of the Old Testament. You did good. So here are our recap of our lessons. Be you. Like, be you. Like, learn from other people. Absolutely. Pick up on principles, read books, do all of the things, but all of that stuff has to run through the filter of who God has made you to be. Be you. Stay in your lane. Do what God has called you to do. Don't just go jump on what everybody else is doing because maybe he hasn't called you to that thing. You're not going to experience the fulfillment and purpose that other people are if it's what they're called to, unless you're doing what you're called to do. So be you and stay in your lane. If you're wearing somebody else's armor, if you're wearing somebody else's fit, take it off. The second one would be our circumstances, our giants, they don't really have the authority to intimidate us. Really, right? Who has the authority over my life? If I'm living for God, if I'm living a life that is in pursuit of Jesus and representing him well, who has the ultimate authority over my life? He does, which means that there is no circumstance and there is no situation that I'm going to be faced with that will ultimately have the authority to create intimidation in my life. So I don't have to live intimidated. The next one would be your greatest battle can become your greatest weapon. Like the things that you've gone through, God, again, we talked about this last week, God does not waste anything. Anything. We'll look years down the road and we'll have this one thing that we went through this one time with this one person, and you'll have a full circle moment where you realize that God used even that little thing to help you or help someone else to become who it is that we're supposed to be. And as always, stay humble. Stay humble. If you win, man, and we pray that you do, we want to rejoice with those who rejoice. But also, let's stay humble. Amen? Let me pray for us. Jesus, thank you so much for these lessons from a man after your own heart. And God, I pray ultimately that through this series that's kind of our aspiration, that we want to become people who are after your own heart also. God, we want to learn what that means, what it takes, and how we get to that place where we are in pursuit of you, to know you, to love you, to be called by you, and ultimately to honor you with the way that we live our lives. Jesus, I pray that we would take these principles and apply them to our lives, God, that we don't have to be intimidated by our circumstances. God, that you will use our struggles and our battles to become part of our testimony that will then serve other people. God, that we'll stay humble. And that, God, whatever comes our way, God, we know that you are with us, that you are for us, that we're fighting for you, and that you are ultimately responsible for the outcomes. God, help us to live in faith like David, believing that we don't have to have a spirit of fear, but of love and of power and of a sound mind. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.